All right, I'm going to introduce our last speaker, and then after this, we'll have our Q&A panel session. Dr. Mary O'Callaghan received her PhD in psychology from the University of Notre Dame, and her doctoral studies were funded by an NIH grant for research in developmental disabilities. She has been a public policy fellow at Notre Dame's DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture since 2015, where she focuses on the ethical issues surrounding disability-selective abortion. She has testified before multiple state legislatures in favor of bans on these abortions, spoken at the United Nations about the international scope of abortion of children with Down syndrome, and is a regular faculty at Notre Dame's VITA Institute, a formation program for leaders in the national and international pro-life movement. Dr. O'Callaghan serves on the governing board of the National Catholic Partnership on Disability, where she chairs the Ethics and Public Policy Committee. She has developed numerous pastoral materials on disability for the Catholic Church and was a co-founder of Miriam's Blessing. She is currently a visiting fellow in the Fiat program on faith and mental health at the McGrath Institute for Church Life here at Notre Dame. She and her husband, John, have 5 children, including their youngest son, Tommy, who has Down syndrome and autism. Please join me in welcoming Mary.
Thank you, Christina. Good afternoon. I am so glad to be with you and to be able to continue this conversation today. Just a real quick note, I want to dedicate my presentation to a dear friend and colleague, David Solomon, whose funeral we celebrated last week. He was a founder of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture, one of the sponsors of this conference, and with his keen intellect and contagious joy at the goodness of human life, he valiantly defended the most vulnerable among us, and he would have been thrilled that this conference was taking place and that you were all here. My topic, a discussion of trisomy 21 or Down syndrome, might seem a little bit out of place here. I know I've heard Tracy say, for example, that many of the parents she serves are hoping for a diagnosis of Down syndrome when there's an indication that there's something wrong, just because there's no fear, right, of an early death. But this has not always been the case, right, with Down syndrome. The life expectancy of many children was very short until the latter part of the 20th century. Related to this, and I think what's important here, is that the current battle for appropriate medical treatment of infants with conditions like trisomy 13 and 18 has already played out in similar fashion, right, with Down syndrome, beginning in the early 1970s and reaching a crisis point in 1982, which was 40 years ago. For decades leading up to this, children with Down syndrome were considered so unfit for society that many who lived past birth were consigned to institutions. The battle for those with trisomy 21 to be recognized as equal members of the human community has been a long one, right, and is far from over. In many ways, though, I think this battle opened up a path for their younger brothers and sisters with other trisomies and a myriad of other so-called life-limiting diagnoses. And so its history is an important one because it's not just a timeline of events, but it's a history of attitudes, right, of ethical arguments about good and bad, of public policies and medical guidelines. But above all, it's a story of the tenacity of these little ones, right, of their will to live despite all odds and the most unlikely arrangement of chromosomes. So I share this history with you, especially those families who are here, in the spirit of friendship and solidarity. As G.K. Chesterton once said, we're all in the same boat on a stormy sea, and we owe each other a terrible loyalty. To give you an idea of where I'm headed very briefly, just want to hit on 5 kind of historical points. I want to cover the early prognosis for those with Down syndrome. I want to talk about the role of medical care and sort of where that came from, right? It didn't just sort of emerge naturally, but it came as a result, in part, of legislation and policy. And then I want to talk about where we are today in the Down syndrome community and the battle that we're still up against. So let's begin at the beginning. Down syndrome was first identified as a medical condition in 1866 by Langdon Down, as many of you know. So we have some epidemiological data dating back to the early 1900s. We don't consider Down syndrome among the life-limiting conditions today, but historically, life expectancy was very low, lower than most people realize, in fact. I had seen a figure previously for example, that in the 1920s, the average life expectancy was around 9 years old, which I thought was rather high based on what I knew. And this was confirmed by some data that I came across recently. So this is really interesting because this graph captures age at death, right, from 1900 all the way up to 2010. And if we look at the average life expectancy, so that's the blue line, right, on this graph, we see that the average life expectancy at around 1900 was about 4 years. And we're just looking up to about 1970, you see kind of it reached maybe 9 or 10 years, right, around 1970. But that's only half of the picture. Take a look instead at the red line in this picture. That's the median. That's the median age. So through my lens, right, as a statistician, I know that when there's a discrepancy like this between the mean and the median, right, what that means, instead of having a nice normal distribution, a nice curve, we have data that's all bunched up at one end. So in this case, the data is bunched up, right, around a year of age. What's bringing up the mean there is some outliers in the data, okay? So what we have then is a story, and actually, look at this line down here. This is the 25th percentile. That's right at birth. So what that's telling us is that all the way up to 1970, about 25% of children with Down syndrome, right, were dying at birth. 50% were dying 1 year or below, right? And then what happened is, as the average goes up a little bit, we have, thank goodness, right, we have some children who were defying the odds and living a little longer, and those are what's bringing the average up. So the reason I emphasize this is not because I have some morbid fascination with death, but if we were to look at the data only before 1970, right, we call Down syndrome a very life-limiting condition. Even for the half that survived to birth or a little beyond, few, if any, made it out of childhood. However, as you can see, of course, that's only part of this graph. Beginning in the late 60s, right, and continuing on until the present, we only have data till 2010 here, but the life expectancy, right, goes up pretty dramatically. So there was a number of social and policy changes as well as advancements, right, in medical technology, which had a tremendous impact on the life expectancy of those with Down syndrome. There's a general point here that I think that we can make. Our assessments of the life-limiting nature of medical conditions are not infallible. The limits of life depend on factors, right, which can change. The story of the dramatic rise in life expectancy of Down syndrome should make us wonder, right, what other groups of infants were mistakenly consigning to this category, and also what factors might impact, right, life expectancy for them. Obviously, changes in medical management were important drivers, right, of this upward trajectory. And we'll come back to this in a moment, but there was another factor at play which I think is worth mentioning, and that was deinstitutionalization, right, moving those with Down syndrome out of institutions. Before the 1980s, and I actually came to graduate school here in the late 80s, and there was still an institution where children with Down syndrome were housed across the street from Notre Dame, and I don't think that institution closed down until maybe 1996. So before the 80s, a vast number of individuals with Down syndrome were institutionalized, and many of those at birth. Institutionalization obviously was a historical atrocity in its own right, and the conditions were deplorable. Lack of human contact, medical care, sanitation, as well as general neglect, abuse, et cetera, all contributed to low life expectancy. And so it's not surprising that lifespan increased when these institutions began to close. The push to do so began in the 60s and continued through the 80s and 90s. And this might not seem to have relevance for the current situation involving the other trisomies, but I think there's some really important points that we can draw out of the story. The first point was that it was not just life expectancy that was grossly underestimated, but also ability level. And this was very much related to institutionalization. The children with Down syndrome were not expected to be able to feed and dress themselves, let alone read or write or speak. And as an aside, of course, this became a self-fulfilling prophecy because conditions in these institutions were such that no human being could be expected to flourish. I had an older cousin with Down syndrome who was institutionalized in the 50s. Her parents were informed by their physician as well as their priest that the family wouldn't be able to care for the little girl. And long after she had died of pneumonia at the age of 20, and I had my own son with Down syndrome, one of my aunts said, of course, that little Cornelia was different, right? Her behaviors were such that she never could have lived. outside of an institution. And I didn't have the heart to tell her that this was simply the little girl's reaction, right, to living outside of the warmth of a family. Because indeed, when institutions began to close and individuals were taken home by their families, when appropriate medical care was offered, and this happened to be about the same time, and therapies and education developed to meet their unique needs, these children surpassed all expectations. So infants with Down syndrome were given a prognosis that was wrong on 2 counts, right? Life expectancy and severity of the disability in terms of things like adaptive skills and cognitive functioning. The chromosomal makeup, right, over that 70-year period didn't change at all. But we adapted the medical and social environments to allow for greater flourishing. So history has shown that we should approach children with congenital anomalies with a great deal of humility, right, and wonder, distrustful of current prognoses. And this is a really important lesson, and we want to sort of hold this hope because it's hopeful, right? But we want to hold it carefully, not letting it obscure another important point that we should take away from the historical treatment of those with Down syndrome, which is that all of the achievements of those with Down syndrome are at the same time, right, and in another sense, completely irrelevant to this discussion. The atrocities committed, right, in institutionalization, for example, were not wrong because it turns out in reality, right, that people with Down syndrome could achieve much more than we previously believed. They were unconscionable because they constituted our response to the most vulnerable of infants in front of us. And in truth, it is only those actions in that long ago present moment which mattered, right? Not the unseen future potential of these children. Institutionalization was particularly concerning because even if we can't imagine its recurrence now, if we think that can't happen, the ideas and attitudes behind it, of course, have persisted. The institutionalization of the intellectually disabled was a widespread tactic, as you probably know, of the eugenics movement of the 1900s. Our state has the sad legacy of really being the beginning of the eugenics movement. Happened here in Indiana. It was used, so institutionalization was used to segregate these individuals, right, as a means of limiting reproduction and protecting society from their influence. Involuntary sterilization was commonplace. And the U.S. eugenics movement, right, fell into popular disfavor in the 1940s at the end of World War II. The science behind it had already been discredited. And then, of course, right, in Nazi Germany, we saw the logical conclusion of where this would go. And these are individuals with disability that were killed under the T4 program in Germany. We know clear well that a society bent on destroying its weakest members destroys itself as well, right? We know that, we've seen it. But we didn't learn this lesson well enough. The discriminatory practices of both eugenic sterilization and institutionalization of those with disabilities continued on for decades. As I said, when I came to Notre Dame in 1988, there was still an institution across the street. Eugenics seems to have changed form, right? But not gone away. We've already discussed this today. There has been steadily growing public outcry in the past decade as the eugenic implications of increased prenatal testing become apparent, right? You know that in Denmark and Iceland, for example, we have almost decimated the population of those with Down syndrome through prenatal testing. But this eugenics argument is gathering strength. In recent judiciary opinions in the United States, issued from circuit courts all the way up to the Supreme Court, justices have supported the argument that the use of abortion to screen for and eradicate individuals with disabilities is eugenic. And that's really important in terms of having that legal precedent there. And as you know, these eugenic attitudes and practices are not limited to the prenatal period, as we'll discuss more later, and we've already discussed today, but they surface whenever those or individuals with disabilities are most vulnerable. This fact is quite familiar to the Down syndrome community, which brings us to the issue of medical treatment of these children. A battle, as I said, quite similar to the one that you all are fighting today, was fought in the 20th century over discriminatory withholding of medical treatment. You might be familiar, right, sadly familiar with the Baby Doe case, which happened in Indiana, right down in Bloomington in 1982. And I'll get to that in a moment, but I want to start with an even earlier case, which happened a decade earlier at Johns Hopkins in 1971. They were both very similar cases, but with some different implications. The 1971 case is widely referred to as the Hopkins Mongol case. I'm sorry for the language, but the word mongoloid was an acceptable term at the time for trisomy 21. And the infant in this case was a little boy with Down syndrome who was born with duodenal atresia, right? I'm not a doctor, so you might be able to explain it better, but I understand that it's an intestinal obstruction, right? Not uncommon in these infants. Basically, food and nutrition couldn't pass from his stomach right to the rest of his intestines, so basically he couldn't receive nutrition or hydration in his condition. But in the 1970s, the surgical technique to correct this was very well established, right? But after a genetics consult, the parents, which revealed that their son had Down syndrome, the parents refused this very simple surgery, which would have allowed their child to eat and drink. And the infant died a painful death of dehydration and pneumonia 15 days later. And this was before comfort care. Not that that would have made it better, we'll talk about that, but there was no comfort here at all. There are several features of this case worth mentioning. First, this was not an isolated event at all, but one of many in which standard medical treatments were withheld on the basis of Down syndrome. In fact, at Johns Hopkins, a nearly identical case had occurred just a few years prior. And what's interesting about this is that the chief of pediatrics at the time, his name was Dr. Robert Cook, was vehemently opposed to this. He actually had 2 children at home with Cri-du-Chat syndrome, and had a heart for those with disabilities. And he even approached a judge to try to get a court order, right, to get guardianship from the parents so that he could order the surgery, but it was unsuccessful. The parents in this case were even Catholic, and so he tried appealing to their faith. But they consulted a priest who counseled that this was actually extraordinary care. This surgery would have been extraordinary care, extraordinary means. And so this child also died of severe dehydration. So when this nearly identical case, this case in 1971, presented itself, Dr. Cook continued to oppose the decision, but felt that he had exhausted his options. He didn't know that he had any recourse. But his opposition to these really cruel deaths that he had observed really galvanized those around him. And this moment is actually considered by many to be the beginning of the modern bioethics movement. Cook was not the only one deeply troubled as this infant lay dying. It was particularly, honestly, traumatizing for the nurses who had to observe this on the unit. So a number of nurses and physicians and residents and clergy would gather in Cook's office, and eventually a sort of informal ethics committee was formed. It was nicknamed the God Committee by those on the outside, and it was the first committee of its kind by all accounts. In addition, Cook had the idea of raising awareness, so he approached the Kennedy Foundation and he convinced them to produce a film. It was a dramatization which combined the 2 stories kind of into one. It's still available on YouTube. You can find it. It was called Who Shall Survive? One of the Choices on Our Conscience. And it attracted international attention. In addition, the Kennedy Foundation, which had already been involved in research and treatment of those with disabilities, now turned its focus to ethical questions and disability and founded bioethics centers at Georgetown and Harvard and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I report this development with a little bit of mixed feelings because certainly these cases cried out, for the development of ethical standards to prevent similar atrocities from happening. At the same time, we know that hospital ethics committees and bioethicists in general are not always friendly, to the cause of life. In fact, my husband, who's a philosopher, often refers to the killing fields of bioethics because ethicists are so adept, at justifying killing of these vulnerable individuals. Thankfully, as Tracy and others have mentioned, we have solid bioethical resources in the church. The National Catholic Bioethics Center is a good example, the ethical and religious directives that Tracy shared today. But in any event, although these cases sparked ethical debate and public awareness, there was no evidence at this point in terms of practice. It would take the tragedy of another case that had to be repeated again to finally spark enough public outrage to affect a policy or to affect a change in policy. And And this was the Baby Doe case in 1982 in Bloomington, Indiana. This was, again, a horrific case. The child was born with Down syndrome, and this time, I think, esophageal atresia. So, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like that the two ends of the esophagus not connected. So, again, this child, the bottom line was this child could not receive any nutrition or hydration. This time, it was the attending obstetrician who had advised against surgical repair, maintaining that surgery promised only a 50% likelihood of success, and that either way the child's outcome would be bleak. He gave testimony later to the Commission on Civil Rights in which he said, he told the parents that often these children are little more than blobs. The parents followed his counsel and refused to provide consent for the surgery. And again, there was opposition. Both the family's regular physician and a local pediatrician objected really strenuously. They sought court intervention. They even lined up adoptive families. There were a number of families that were willing to take in this baby, even to pay for his surgery. When lower courts upheld the family's decision, the case was prepared to be heard by the Supreme Court, which was too slow to benefit the child who died of dehydration and pneumonia at 6 years of age. And the decision by the court is almost mind-boggling. The court finds that the state has failed to show that the child's physical or mental condition is seriously impaired or seriously endangered as a result of the inability, refusal, or neglect of his parents to supply the child with necessary food and medical care. So again, mind-boggling. And it's even sort of more, it defies the imagination that this case was being heard in the court at the same time that the child was starving to death at the hospital, right? That these were happening at the same time. And there wouldn't have been enough time anyway, but to think that they could be arguing this while a child is across town dying in a very painful death. There was a huge amount of public outcry at the time. Newspapers across the nation carried this story. Pro-life and disability groups decried the case as infanticide and discriminatory against those with cognitive disabilities. And this was debated extensively in the public square. I want to play a short clip for you. This came out of a PBS station in Minneapolis, and I found it just hauntingly prophetic. 40 years ago, a representative from a pro-life group speaks of the trauma involved in the diagnosis of infants like Baby Doe, and she makes a plea for the type of advocacy and support which Be Not Afraid offers. It was though we're echoing, through all these years, and finally picked up by Tracy Windsor and Be Not Afraid. So let me
continue to press for even tougher legislation against what they term infanticide. Minnesota Human Life Alliance member Mary Sinander.
Infanticide cases are happening frequently, perhaps more frequently than the public is aware of. It has been estimated that some 4,000 to 5,000 newborn infants are being left to or encouraged to die each year in American hospitals. What's happening, and what we're seeing is happening, is that in the trauma of having a baby born who is less perfect than the hopeful parents had expected, bad decisions are being made. Doctors oftentimes create an atmosphere of hopelessness versus hope. What we need is someone there to intercede and to be the advocate of the baby at a time when others might not be making just decisions.
My guess is the only thing that Be Not Afraid might add to this conversation, that the parents also need advocacy. Often we see this portrayed, sort of progression portrayed as, in the beginning, it was parents who were asking, right, or refusing these treatments, denying medical care. And many people think that we have a swing now where it's parents asking for the care and it's physicians denying it. But my sense is probably that many of these parents in these cases did feel pressured, right, or felt hopeless around these cases, and so also needed advocates as well. But the plight of Baby Doe reverberated all the way up to the federal level. C. Everett Koop, U.S. Surgeon General at the time, had experience with surgical repairs during his tenure as Surgeon-in-Chief at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and he had shown a success rate of 100% with these surgeries. The backstory of Koop is that he pioneered surgical techniques for conditions which many considered life-threatening at the time. So hydrocephalus, diaphragmatic hernias, et cetera. But more generally, he was a champion of these really vulnerable babies. So with Koop in the lead, the official response of the Reagan administration was to notify public hospitals that they would lose funding if they did not provide treatment to handicapped infants. And they cited, disability advocacy at all. They cited Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which at the time, this was before the ADA, right? This was a bedrock of disability rights in this country. And they also issued what came to be called the first baby doe rules. And all affected hospitals had to post these big signs in their units saying that discriminatory failure to feed or care for handicapped infants in this facility is prohibited by federal law. So these were in, NICUs at the time. The posters provided the name or the number of a 24-hour hotline for anonymous informers who wanted to report suspected discrimination. And then there were teams of investigators, they called them the baby doe squads, that have full access to patient medical records. They would come in and investigate if there was a complaint. It seems clear to me that given the heinous nature of baby doe's death and the overwhelming public outcry, that there was a need for some type of intervention in these situations. As Justice Scalia would later write in his opinion in the partial birth abortion case, Gonzalez versus Carhart, there can be no doubt the government has an interest in protecting the integrity and ethics of the medical profession. And so, excuse me, I think I lost the page, that's okay, of the medical profession. So it seems, again, sort of self-evident that we should step in and regulate this in some manner. But the reaction of the medical community, at least the official medical community, to being regulated in this manner was explosive and it was swift. A number of medical groups protested this intrusion by the government into medicine. And so the baby doe rules were rewritten over the course of a very intense series of lawsuits, court cases, appeals, etc., which began in the lower courts and went all the way up to the Supreme Court. I'm going to just really briefly trace out this series of events because I think we can draw some important lessons from it. So first, the American Academy of Pediatrics sued the Department of Health and Human Services in a move to stop the rules from taking effect. The judge in this case actually ruled that the baby doe rules were invalid, but on a technicality, they hadn't waited the 60-day waiting period. There was some other criticisms, but that was the main reason for throwing them out. The Reagan administration didn't even appeal this decision, but they just simply submitted another set of nearly identical rules in July of '83, this time following the 50-day or the 60-day comment period that was required, and they answered some of the critiques by establishing some more sort of concrete medical criteria. What happened next was that another challenge came to the rules, not by a medical group, but this time in the form of another baby doe. This time a little girl, little Jane Doe, who was born in Stony Brook Hospital in Long Island, New York. She didn't have Down syndrome, but she had spina bifida and some other medical issues, including a very small head, cranial fluid buildup, and kidney problems. And the parents, upon hearing that she might have developmental delays, cognitive impairment, etc., chose what they call palliative care, consisting of antibiotics and just a dressing, right, for the spinal lesion, rather than surgery, which would have been typical at the time. It was commonplace, obviously, to repair those lesions. And this case quickly became very complicated and very contested. Advocates contended that discrimination was occurring. It seemed that it was because a decision was made on the basis of the microcephaly and the likelihood of cognitive impairment. In fact, a state pro-life attorney stepped in. He tried to have the parents' decision overruled by one division of the New York Supreme Court, which ruled in his favor. But then the next day, another division, I think the appellate court, reversed that decision. So the case then went on to the highest state court, which was a New York Court of Appeals in this case, titled Weber versus Stony Brook Hospital. In this case, judges ruled in favor of the parents, right, citing that the attorney had no connection to the family and couldn't make these kind of decisions. However, at this point, the new baby doe rules had gone into effect, the ones that Reagan had previously rewritten, and because there was an accusation of discrimination in this case, the U.S. Justice Department stepped in and they demanded that the hospital release the baby's medical records to the baby doe squads. The hospital refused, and this resulted in yet another lawsuit, right? This time the this was United States, so the Justice Department versus University Hospital, which is just another name for Stony Brook Hospital. So, sorry, I lost my train in all of these lawsuits. So, in November of that year, the U.S. District court ruled in favor of the hospital, and they upheld the parents' decision as reasonable and concerned with what they termed the child's best interest. You know, that's sort of an ethical term, as a best interest standard. In February of 1984, this case reached a higher court, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and they upheld the lower court's ruling. The wording that was used in this majority opinion for this case seemed to signal an end to the baby doe rules. Essentially, opinion stated that Section 504, so that disability legislation, was never intended to employ federal resources to save handicapped newborns. And they also disputed that there was any evidence of discrimination. However, the Reagan administration, again, was undeterred. In the midst of these court cases and before the verdict even came out, they just issued another set of baby doe rules. And this time, the baby doe squads were removed because the courts didn't seem friendly to this. And they implemented in their place kind of some ethics committees. They were called the Infant Care Review Committees at the time. And the idea was that if parents refused life-saving treatments and the suspected grounds for disability, the committees were to have the hospital notify the courts, right? So there's some kind of action plan in place. However, again, there remained considerable opposition to these rules. So in March of 1984, the American Hospital Association and the American Medical Association sued the HHS in another attempt to block the rules. So two courts, one right after the other, ruled that the baby doe rules were unlawful once again. This case, Bowen versus American Hospital Association, made it all the way up to this U.S. Supreme Court almost 2 years later in 1986. The court not only concurred with previous opinions that the rules exceeded the intent of Section 504, but they added that the baby doe rules interfered with the best interests of the child standard, and more generally were an unjustifiable intervention into medicine. Right? So it would appear that this was the end, right, to the baby doe rules. How could they survive after this? However, by the time this decision was handed down, the baby doe rules had already found their home in Congress. So while the cases were making their way up through the judiciary system, the administration at the same time mounted separate efforts in Congress. And in February of 1984, the House of Representatives passed a bill which would render the act of withholding life-saving treatment and nutrition from an infant with a disability punishable as child abuse. This is a really long battle. I think it was fought over the course of about 5 months. It was very contentious, and it basically pitted disability advocates and pro-life groups on one hand, right, with powerful medical lobbies on the other. The bill, which finally passed, was known as the Child Abuse Amendments of 1984. So it was situated in the Child Abuse Protection Act, or CAPTA. While the oversight of this legislation originally involved a hotline, this was transferred eventually to hospital ethics committees and child protective services in each state. So if either parents or physicians under these regulations are suspected of withholding treatment, the ethics board is obligated to report the case to Child Protective Services. These are the amendments. I'm going to just zoom in, though, because this is sort of the important part. Under the amendments, withholding treatment is only permissible under 3 conditions. So basically, if the treatment, if the newborn is comatose, or irreversibly comatose, if the treatment would only prolong the baby's death, or if treatment would be inhumane. But look at this. These exceptions, right, do not include the failure to provide, make an exception for appropriate nutrition, hydration, or medication. So under this amendment, and this still stands today, right, and Tracy was talking about the ethical and religious directives, it's in current law that we need to provide. We are obligated to provide nutrition and hydration to children. That it is not legal to withhold them under the Child Abuse Protection Act, right? So we have this in law. This has not gone away. This was not disputed, but stands as is. So I dragged you, through this bit of history, which I even can get lost in sometimes, because I wanted to make a few points here. First of all, the medical community as a whole, so these powerful organizations, is very resistant to regulation, is very difficult to regulate them, but has been particularly so right in this arena, in these sort of life and death issues. Related to this, disability advocacy groups have noted that it has historically been difficult to enforce civil rights legislation, laws protecting those with disabilities, for example, within the area of medical decision making. So those with disabilities are particularly vulnerable in the field of medicine. But to be a little bit hopeful, I think this is also an example of the importance of tenacity, right, in these fights. We have to be in it for the long haul and persist in the truth, even when all odds seem not against or not in our favor. So it would be nice to stop here with a happy ending. We've got these baby doe rules, right? What could go wrong? But in the baby doe rules, they represent a tremendous amount of advocacy work, right, in honor of a little boy who suffered tremendously, and others like him, many others like him. It would be comforting to think that they provided the safeguards necessary to prevent these tragedies from happening again, but of course, we wouldn't be here today if that was the case. So then, what was the impact of the baby doe rules? Have they had any impact? I've heard often today that that physicians operate in the spirit of baby doe, right? Which basically just means that they accord whatever meaning they want to baby doe regulations. But first, what has been the impact? First, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, physicians have continued to withhold treatment from some newborns. There's no doubt about that. However, this doesn't mean that nothing has changed. Instead, it appears that the threshold for withholding treatment has moved, right? So in general, children with Down syndrome receive life-saving treatment as standard of care, right? But not necessarily, as we know, other infants with other disabilities. But in this change for children with Down syndrome, we have perhaps established a precedent, right? If we're able to move the threshold for infants with Down syndrome, why not other groups of baby does? And this seems to start, it's starting to be, I think, at least gathering a consensus, some small consensus in the literature. I want to mention something else here because I think it's important. It's so important that I'll risk repeating a point I made earlier. We have to be very clear on exactly what the mistake was made in the baby doe case. One of the most chilling ethical analyses I've heard is that the decision in the baby doe case might be seen as the application of sound ethics to bad prognostic information, right? No chance of any quality of life is what this ethicist said. In other words, the ethicist is saying is that we made a mistake to let baby doe die because it turns out that people with Down syndrome are capable of achieving a good quality of life after all. So we need to be absolutely clear that in the first place, this decision was wrong because it caused great suffering for this child. To ignore that, right, is to see these individuals as something less than human, as though these are abstract sort of ethical debates. And even if suffering had not been involved, withholding medical treatment was a grave moral evil because it was the ultimate form of discrimination, right? The child was deprived of life because he had a disability, and precisely because we let quality of life judgments enter into the equation. So we're not fighting, as you know, for appropriate medical care on the basis that infants with trisomy 13 or 18 can achieve some arbitrary standard and preconceived notion of quality of life. When I say that they may be the next baby does, I don't mean that the goal is that they can become like children with Down syndrome, whatever that means, or anyone else. We're fighting so they may have life itself. God said that life was good, right? He determines its quality, which comes from being loved by him and in relationship with one another. I think it's difficult to assess the total impact of the Doe rules, but I want to stress that change was also taking place outside of government intervention as well. While these very public ethical debates and court cases were taking place, and powerful medical organizations and lobby groups were fighting the baby doe regulations, there was at the same time a quieter revolution taking place in medicine. Tracy mentioned earlier the good physicians, right, that we encounter There was heroic physicians doing the really sort of patient and unglamorous work of chart reviews, right? Compiling statistics on survival rates of medical procedures, doing the pioneering work of performing heart and other surgeries on infants with Down syndrome, right? Publishing success stories, supporting families and encouraging their colleagues in this same work of providing an equal standard of medical care. So here's just one small example from the 80s of a team out of State University of New York, some cardiac surgeons who were really pioneering in terms of establishing equal standards of medical care for those with Down syndrome. The luxury of this, as children begin to live longer, was that more data accumulated and it became clear that we weren't just advocating for equal standards, right? But we also wanted unique standards tailored to their appropriate medical needs. And so when the families here said that there's a clinic being established for trisomy 13 and 18, that's incredible. And I think that perhaps in a way that some of the specialty clinics like those for Down syndrome have sort of paved the way, because it's happened, much more quickly, right, than we sort of achieved that in the Down syndrome community. So I think that's a hopeful sign, right, that there's a specialty perhaps. I recently came across this paragraph in an article on treatment of children with Down syndrome, and it struck me, these are the medical guidelines that currently exist for Down syndrome. The lead author in here was our son's pediatrician, developmental pediatrician when he was small, and obviously these have had a huge impact on the health of those individuals with Down syndrome, and another reason we're seeing that trajectory continue to go up. I saw this quote, and it struck me how far we've come from the early days of fighting for medical treatment and from the early days of the baby doe rules. 40 years ago, infants were denied care because they had this extra chromosome, the extra 21st chromosome. And currently, the discussion in the community is how to mitigate some of the effects of the disability and contribute to greater flourishing in this community. So it would, again, be really nice to end on this note, because it looks like we have a happy ending, right? But of course, despite all of this, there remains a monumental problem. And I put it this way to students: at no other time in history have people with Down syndrome enjoyed so many protections, right? Such good medical care, for goodness sake, so many opportunities and so much acceptance. And if the media is any barometer of attitudes, right, we have truly reached the pinnacle of success. The 2018 Gerber baby had Down syndrome, for goodness sake. Beautiful faces of children with Down syndrome graced billboards and advertisements. Every fall, we're treated to another heartwarming story, right, of a teen boy with Down syndrome who scored the winning touchdown. And actors with Down syndrome are starring in feature films. At the same time, infants with Down syndrome are being pursued relentlessly with prenatal testing, and abortion rates in the U.S. after a positive prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome range anywhere from 60 to 90%, depending on demographic group and area of the country. So this fact, right, is relevant for today's discussion, because as long as these eugenic attitudes driving the abortions are allowed to run rampant in prenatal medicine, we can't assume our children will be safe postnatally in that postnatal period. Disability-selective abortions certainly are worth fighting for their own sakes, but it's worth considering the relevance of these attitudes behind them for children with disabilities who are already born. And I'm going to go quickly through these next slides because we're almost out of time. But Coop noted that, early on, he said he feared that the abortion of unwanted babies prepared the moral ground for the decimation of other groups who often impose a burden on their caretakers and on society, namely persons with disabilities and the elderly, etc. We're mistaken if we think that we can contain the eugenic attitudes and the disregard for life, right, to the prenatal period. These attitudes, right, tend to be kind of like a wild animal that are always trying to escape their cage. We see these attitudes, right, openly kind of slinking around the nursery. For example, there was this article from the Journal of Medical Ethics in 2013, and the proposal, the sort of post-birth abortion, seemed shocking to many, but it's hard to fault that deadly logic, right? That if parents can kill their infants with Down syndrome before birth, why should they be stopped from doing so after? We've seen them appear in the case of children who survive abortions. As you know, the Born Alive Act involved a little baby with Down syndrome who was left to die after a botched abortion. But again, if this child was not wanted prenatally, what obligation do we have to him after birth? And so in spite of all the gains made in medical care, and while that is a beautiful and laudable goal, there is still much work to be done for infants with Down syndrome and all children with disabilities. And because I don't want to leave you with these words on the screen, they hardly deserve our attention, I'm going to end with the words of my greatest hero, servant of God, Jerome Lejeune, the brilliant physician who put every ounce of his medical skill into caring and advocating for children with Down syndrome. And he gives us the clearest direction, right, for continuing our work in this area. He said, one sentence, one alone, will determine our course of action, the reasoning which cannot deceive, and furthermore, which judges all things, the very words of Jesus, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. Thank you, and may God bless you all. Thank you for coming.